Imagine driving with only your thoughts as company, replaying every suspicious moment, every vague excuse, every gut-wrenching feeling that something isn't right. That's what I did, gripping the steering wheel tighter with each mile that brought me closer to the Marriott. Rachel had no idea I was coming. She thought she could get away with it, brushing off my questions and pretending everything was fine. But not tonight. I was tired of being played for a fool. I was ready to find out the truth, no matter what it took. And when I finally stepped through that door and saw what she was really up to, let's just say, the truth hit harder than I ever imagined. Rachel and I have been married for 14 years, and we have two amazing kids, Emma, who's 12, and Josh, who's 10. They were staying with my mom for the night, which made this impromptu trip possible. Rachel and I got married right out of high school, after dating for a couple of years. She was always this vibrant, joyful woman, with long brown hair and a smile that could light up a room. But over the last few months, something shifted. Little things started to bother me, subtle changes that left me uneasy. I didn't want to seem paranoid or overly suspicious, so I kept my worries to myself. But when I realized this conference was close enough to make a surprise visit, I knew I had to seize the opportunity. When I arrived at the hotel, I handed my overnight bag to the front desk and introduced myself as Matt Foster. I told the clerk that my wife, Rachel, was attending the insurance conference in room 214 and had told me I could grab a key from the front desk. After confirming my identity, the clerk handed me the key, and I headed straight to the elevator, nerves buzzing the whole way. My mind raced with questions. What would I do if I caught her? Would I knock first or just walk in? Would she be alone? By the time I made my way down the hallway, I decided to just use the key and see what was really happening. Trying to be as quiet as possible, I slid the keycard into the door, easing it open slowly. And there she was, Rachel, sitting at the desk, her briefcase open, shuffling through some paperwork. She turned, visibly startled to see me standing there. I quickly explained that I had some free time and thought I'd drop in and surprise her with dinner. Rachel's reaction caught me off guard. She seemed genuinely happy to see me. She suggested I stay the night, saying she was looking forward to the company. Then she walked over and planted a kiss on me, and I realized that my plan to catch her in the act had completely blown up in my face. But just as I started to feel a wave of relief, I made a joking comment about spending some time together before heading out for dinner. Rachel responded with a playful smile and suggested we have a quick, intimate moment before she hopped in the shower. She even promised me a full night of whatever I wanted afterward. I started to think maybe I really had been imagining things. We shared a brief but passionate moment, and then Rachel headed into the bathroom to shower. I took a deep breath, trying to let go of my earlier suspicions, and sank down onto the bed. As I glanced around, my eyes landed on Rachel's toiletry bag sitting on the dresser. Thinking I could use some aspirin to ease the headache I'd developed from the long drive, I decided to check the bag. But instead of finding painkillers, I found something that made my heart drop, a pack of 6 condoms. I just sat there, staring at those condoms, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions. After Josh was born, Rachel switched to birth control pills, but they made her sick to her stomach. That's when I decided to get a vasectomy, and ever since then, we hadn't needed to use any form of protection. So why the hell did she have condoms in her bag? The realization hit me like a sucker punch. Rachel was cheating on me. There was no other explanation that made sense. But what was I supposed to do now? I couldn't just let this slide. My mind spun in a million different directions, scrambling to figure out my next move. And then, I did something I'm not exactly proud of. I dug deeper into her bag and found a small safety pin, the kind she always kept handy for wardrobe malfunctions. Carefully, I used it to poke tiny holes right in the center of each condom before putting them back exactly where I'd found them. As Rachel was wrapping up in the shower, I grabbed my phone and called my buddy, Tom. He's the kind of friend who'd jump through hoops for you, no questions asked. I told him I needed a favor, nothing too wild, just a quick phone call. I explained that I wanted him to call me in about an hour, pretending there was some emergency back home. I suggested something like a burst pipe at the school, something that'd need my immediate attention and give me a reason to bail. Tom didn't even hesitate. "Got it. I'll call you around 7, he said. I didn't want to spend the night with Rachel, not after what I'd just discovered. The idea of being close to her made my skin crawl. I figured I'd take Tom's call as an excuse to leave, giving me time to clear my head on the drive back home. When Rachel finally stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel and still glowing from her shower, I could barely bring myself to look at her. Every part of me was screaming to confront her, to demand answers. But I bit my tongue. Blowing up wouldn't help. I needed to play it smart and keep my cool until I figured out what to do next. We headed down to the hotel's dining room, and I did my best to act like nothing was wrong. But on the inside, I was crumbling. Rachel seemed completely unaware of my inner turmoil as we sat down at the table. I told her to order whatever she wanted, and she just shrugged, saying she didn't have much of an appetite. She ended up settling on a small filet mignon and suggested we get a bottle of rose to go with it. After we placed our order, I couldn't resist pushing a little, testing the waters. "Are you happy?" I asked, keeping my voice as casual as I could. "With us, I mean. Our marriage." Without missing a beat, she smiled and nodded. "Of course, I am. We have a lovely home, 2 amazing kids, and a husband who loves me. What more could I ask for?" Her words were like a punch to the gut. How could she sit there, saying that, when I knew she was sneaking around behind my back? I forced myself to nod along, but inside I felt like I was unraveling. "I don't know," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough to keep you happy." I paused, then added, "I feel lucky to have you as my wife, Rachel. Honestly, there are times I have to pinch myself just to believe it's all real." She smiled at me, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, and in that moment, I felt a rush of anger and heartbreak so intense it nearly knocked the wind out of me. Here she was, holding my hand, lying to my face, and pretending like everything was perfect. But I kept up the charade, knowing that blowing up now wouldn't change anything. I just had to hold it together until I could get out of there. Rachel just laughed softly and called me a silly goose, saying that's why I'd driven all the way to see her, that I had nothing to worry about because she was perfectly happy and content. Our dinners arrived, and we made small talk throughout the meal, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found in her bag earlier. Every smile, every laugh she gave seemed hollow to me. Then, just as the waiter started clearing our plates, my phone buzzed. It was Tom, right on schedule. I excused myself and stepped out into the lobby to take the call, making sure to wait a few minutes before heading back. When I returned, I plastered on a concerned look and told Rachel that Tom had called about a burst pipe at the school, and I needed to head back as soon as possible to help out. Her face fell, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine disappointment or just irritation that her evening plans had been cut short. Either way, her reaction was telling. Whether I stayed or left didn't seem to matter all that much to her. As we walked back toward the elevator, a man I'd never seen before stepped out and greeted Rachel like an old friend. He was tall, with sandy hair and a confident grin that made my skin crawl. He introduced himself as Matt Bradley and mentioned that he'd stopped by her room earlier, but no one had answered. He turned to me, extending his hand. "Rachel talks about you all the time." "I'm Matt," he said with a bright smile. I forced a grin and shook his hand, though the act of pretending everything was fine made my stomach churn. As we rode up in the elevator, I could feel my blood pressure climbing. This had to be the guy. This was the man she was sneaking around with. I was sure of it. Once we were back in the room, I didn't bother beating around the bush. I turned to Rachel, heart pounding, and told her flat out that I wanted her to quit her job. I couldn't stand the idea of her working with Matt anymore. We'd touched on this issue before, but this time I made it clear, it was non-negotiable. She fired back instantly, saying she wasn't quitting and that I needed to get over my baseless paranoia about her and Matt. She made it sound like I was the one with the problem, like I was the one making things up in my head. After a quick, cold kiss, I grabbed my bags and stormed out of the hotel, anger and betrayal roiling inside me. The entire drive back home, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I hated her for what she was doing, and I hated myself even more for feeling so helpless to stop it. Divorce was all I could think about, but without any hard evidence, I felt cornered, trapped. I knew she was cheating, but what could I do about it without proof? 2 days later, Rachel came home from the conference, acting like everything was just peachy. She was cheerful, almost annoyingly so, which only stoked my rage even more. I had to do something. While she was busy unpacking her suitcase, I couldn't stop myself. I rummaged through her bag again, desperate for some kind of validation. And there it was. One last condom, still intact, with the tiny hole I'd poked in it. How many had she gone through in just the few days she'd been away? The thought turned my stomach. That Saturday, her company, Liberty Insurance, hosted a picnic for employees and their families. The kids were excited about it, looking forward to the games and treats, but I was dreading the whole thing. I couldn't shake the feeling that some of her coworkers knew about the affair, and I cringed at the thought of being the center of office gossip or the butt of private jokes. I probably was being paranoid, but considering everything I'd uncovered, how could I not be? The picnic was being held at a big park just outside town, and as we arrived, the tension in my chest tightened. Rachel seemed at ease, laughing with the kids and waving to her colleagues, but I kept scanning the crowd, looking for Matt's smug face. I tried to put on a good front for Sarah and Josh, but I felt like I was standing in the middle of a room full of people who were all in on some sick joke that I was just now figuring out. As the day dragged on, I tried to play along, tossing a ball around with Josh and helping Sarah with some arts and crafts, but I couldn't focus. I kept catching snippets of conversation, someone calling out Matt's name, someone else laughing, and every sound made my skin prickle. When Matt finally showed up, I watched Rachel's reaction carefully. There it was, just a flicker of something in her eyes, a slight straightening of her posture, but it was enough. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, running on autopilot, trying not to let my bitterness show in front of the kids. Rachel stayed close to me, playing the part of the doting wife, but I wasn't fooled. The sight of her smiling and chatting like nothing was wrong made my blood boil. By the time we left, I was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and physically. But one thing was clear, I couldn't live like this anymore. Something had to give, and I wasn't going to be the one breaking under the pressure. I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof that I could use to end this nightmare once and for all. Because if I didn't get that soon, I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it together. Rachel was in her element at the picnic, laughing and chatting easily with her coworkers, especially Matt. They didn't act openly affectionate or anything, but there was a kind of familiarity between them that I couldn't ignore. It was as if, whenever they spoke, the rest of the world faded away. I did my best to keep a low profile, blending into the background, not wanting to draw any attention to myself. Then, a woman I hadn't met before approached me and introduced herself as Janet Bradley, Matt's wife. She was striking, long auburn hair, piercing blue eyes, the kind of woman you'd expect to see gracing the cover of a magazine. For a moment, I was taken aback. How could Matt cheat on someone like her? I mean, I'd always thought highly of Rachel, loved her even, but Janet was something else entirely. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, and after a few minutes of small talk, we decided to find a quieter spot to talk. We ended up on a pair of benches near the lake, far enough from the picnic area that we could speak freely without prying ears. I could tell right away that Janet had something serious weighing on her mind. She hesitated, glancing down at her hands like she was still debating whether or not to say anything. Finally, I decided to break the ice for her. I found out about the affair just this week, I admitted quietly. The relief that washed over her face was immediate and undeniable. I've known for about 2 months, she confessed, exhaling deeply. And I've already decided to file for divorce. I even hired a private investigator to gather evidence. That took me by surprise. Janet didn't seem like the kind of person who'd wait around and suffer in silence. She was calm, collected, but underneath that composed exterior, I could sense a determination as sharp as a blade. My lawyer suggested reaching out to Claire, she continued, to see if she'd be willing to testify or at least sign a notarized statement about the affair to strengthen my case against Matt. What kind of proof do you have? I asked, suddenly feeling like I'd been handed a lifeline. Photos, taped phone conversations, no videos yet, but plenty to make a solid case, she said firmly. And, she paused, studying my expression, I'm wondering if you'd want to use some of the same evidence for your own divorce proceedings. She then told me she planned to sue Liberty Insurance for negligence, stating that several other employees were aware of the affair and had done nothing to address it. Janet was dead set on making Matt, and Rachel, pay for what they'd done. She suggested that we work together, sharing any evidence we had, and I agreed immediately. It made sense to team up, 2 people pursuing the same goal, united in betrayal. Before we headed back to the picnic, Janet invited me over to her house the next morning. Matt would be out golfing, and she thought it'd be a good time to show me everything she'd gathered. She lived at 26, Hemlock Avenue in Crestmont, just a short drive from where we were. We both chuckled awkwardly, acknowledging that this wasn't a date, it was more like a strategic alliance. Still, it felt like we were in this together now. When we returned to the picnic, it didn't seem like anyone had noticed we were gone. Rachel was still mingling with her coworkers, chatting and laughing as if everything was perfectly normal. But I felt a strange sense of hope, like maybe there was a way out of this mess after all. The next morning, Rachel announced she'd be heading out to do some shopping and would be gone for a few hours. As soon as she left, I dropped the kids off at my mom's place and drove over to Janet's. When I pulled up to the house, she greeted me at the door, looking as composed and put together as ever. There was something almost regal about the way she carried herself, even now. She welcomed me in and led me to her den, where stacks of papers and folders lined the coffee table, evidence of the chaos that Matt and Rachel had unleashed on both our lives. Coffee? She offered with a polite smile. No, thanks, I replied, feeling a mix of anticipation and nerves. Janet nodded, then motioned for me to take a seat. I've got everything I could gather so far. Phone records, receipts, and a lot of photos. I took a deep breath and sat down, scanning the neatly organized files spread out in front of us. It was surreal, seeing everything laid out like this, the proof of their betrayal catalogued so meticulously. You've really been busy, I murmured, almost in awe of her resolve. Had to be, she said softly. I needed to be sure I had enough to confront him and not get swept under the rug. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. I get it. I felt like I was going crazy these last few weeks, not knowing for sure. Well, now you'll know, she said, handing me a thick folder labeled October-November. It's all here. Dates, times, even some audio. It's enough to make any judge see things our way. I opened the folder, my heart pounding as I flipped through the evidence, grainy photos of Matt and Rachel at a hotel, phone transcripts that read like a sordid romance novel, and detailed timelines of their meetups. I felt a surge of both anger and relief. I hadn't been imagining it. They'd been making a fool of me for months, and I finally had the proof. This is more than I expected, I said quietly. Janet sighed, leaning back on the couch. I know it's a lot. And I'm sorry you have to see it like this. No, don't be, I replied, shaking my head. It's exactly what I needed. We spent the rest of the morning going through her files, piecing together a clear picture of what had been happening behind our backs. With each document, each bit of evidence, my resolve hardened. I wasn't just going to sit back and let this play out. I was going to fight. For my sanity, for my dignity, for my kids. When we finally wrapped up, I left Janet's house feeling strangely lighter. For the first time in weeks, I knew what I needed to do. I was going to get out of this mess, one way or another. And I wasn't going to do it alone. The room was surprisingly cozy, furnished with a large leather couch that faced a computer monitor set up on the table. The screen displayed a live feed of an empty motel room, and I had no idea what was about to unfold. Janet motioned for me to sit and offered me something to drink. I settled on a Pepsi, then asked her what exactly we were looking at. She smirked slightly and said, "We're about to watch Tom play a round of golf, live and in full color." Then she leaned in a little closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "You might recognize the caddy." I stared at her, confused for a second, until it clicked. She was talking about Rachel. "Wait, how did you even set this up?" I asked, baffled. With a casual wave of her hand, Janet mentioned that the whole setup had cost her about $1,400, but she figured Tom would end up covering the bill one way or another. The live surveillance session was supposed to last a couple of hours, so she urged me to get comfortable. She'd even gone all out with snacks, popcorn and nachos, like we were settling in for some kind of twisted movie night. Then she assured me she'd give me a DVD copy of the whole thing afterward, just in case I wanted to review it. She admitted that while part of her dreaded watching, another part couldn't look away. She needed to see it for herself. For the next 20 minutes or so, we made small talk. Janet shared more sordid details about the affair, backing up her words with photos, playing audio recordings, and laying out neatly organized documents. With each new piece of evidence, I felt like I was sinking deeper into a pit of despair. The extent of Rachel and Tom's involvement was staggering. It was painful to see, yet oddly, it was also exactly what I needed, to know for certain, to finally put all the doubts to rest. Then, just as Janet had predicted, the monitor flickered to life. My heart skipped a beat. There they were, Tom and Rachel, walking into the motel room together. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness. They didn't waste a second before starting to undress, not even bothering with small talk or any semblance of decency. The video was crystal clear, though the audio was a little garbled. Still, the message was unmistakable. My stomach twisted as I watched my wife, the woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my children, stand there, stripping down for another man. It was surreal, like watching a nightmare unfold right in front of me. Janet, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood with a half-hearted comment about Claire's figure being the kind you don't often see. I forced a smile, but I had no idea how to respond. I felt sick, disgusted. It wasn't the kind of sight you just brushed off. This was my life unraveling on a screen. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to Janet, shaking my head. "I've seen enough. I don't need to watch the rest of this." She nodded, letting out a deep breath as if she'd been holding it the whole time. "Yeah, I get it. It's a lot. I don't really want to keep watching either." We agreed to stop the video, both of us knowing that our lawyers had more than enough to work with now. But even after the screen went dark, the images were still seared into my mind. Seeing her like that, I muttered, trying to put the words together, "Especially with you sitting right here, it's more than I can handle." Janet nodded slowly, sympathy softening her gaze. "I know. It's like some twisted version of reality. Watching it happen, knowing it's real, but still not being able to wrap your head around it." We both sat there for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. Then she glanced at me and said, "Let's do something else. I could show you my koi pawns. They're a lot more peaceful than this mess." I almost laughed out loud. Anything sounded better than sitting here with more videos of Rachel and Tom. "Yeah, that sounds great," I replied, relieved. Her face lit up, and she led me outside to her backyard. It was a welcome change of pace, like stepping into a completely different world. The tension from the house seemed to lift as soon as we stepped out into the open air. The koi ponds were incredible. She had 3 of them, each more impressive than the last, filled with vibrant fish gliding gracefully through the water. Janet explained the intricate pumping and filtration systems she'd installed herself, and I found myself surprisingly engrossed. With my background in plumbing, I couldn't help but admire her handiwork. "You built all this?" I asked, genuinely impressed. She nodded, smiling a little. "Yeah. It started out as a small project a few years back, but it kind of turned into a passion." "You did a hell of a job," I said, leaning closer to inspect the setup. "I can't even imagine the work that went into getting it just right." Her smile widened. "Thanks. It's been a lot of trial and error, but it's therapeutic, you know. Something about watching the fish swim around, the sound of the water, it just calms me." I knew what she meant. Standing there beside her, watching the koi lazily swim in circles, I felt some of the tension I'd been carrying ease up a bit. It was the first time in a long while that I'd felt anything close to peace. "Maybe I should look into one of these for myself," I joked lightly, though a part of me wasn't entirely kidding. Something about the stillness of the water, the quiet tranquility of the pond, made me feel a little less like I was losing my grip. "You're welcome to come by any time," Janet offered softly. "It's nice to have someone appreciate them." We stood there for a while, just talking about the ponds and the fish, avoiding the darker subject of what had brought us together in the first place. For that brief span of time, I almost forgot why I was even there. It felt good to focus on something else for a change, something simple, something that wasn't tangled up in lies and betrayal. But as we made our way back into the house, reality came crashing back. I glanced at the folders and papers strewn across the coffee table, a stark reminder of the mess I still had to untangle. The proof, the pain, the path ahead, it was all there, waiting for me. But for now, standing next to Janet, I felt just a little bit stronger. Strong enough to face what was coming. Because for the first time, I knew I wasn't in this alone. I offered to lend Janet a hand any time she needed help, mostly out of curiosity to learn more about her koi ponds. Spending time with her was a plus, but there was nothing romantic about it, not yet, anyway. We ended up chatting out there for hours, the time flying by as we talked about everything except our cheating spouses. It was a welcome distraction. By the time we headed back inside, the motel room on the monitor was empty, a sign that Tom and Rachel had wrapped up and gone their separate ways. That was my cue to leave, too. Janet walked me to the door, thanking me for coming by and promising to call when Tom's next golf game came up. She even suggested I bring Emma and Josh over to see the koi ponds. It was a nice gesture, a small bit of positivity to look forward to in the middle of all this mess. As I drove home, I felt a jumble of emotions, relief, anger, and just a glimmer of hope that maybe, somehow, I'd get through this. The next few weeks were brutal. Every time Rachel took a shower, I found myself rifling through her bag, and every single time, there was a fresh supply of condoms. I couldn't wrap my head around when she was using them all. It was like she had this whole hidden life I wasn't part of. That safety pin stayed on my keychain, always ready for the next batch I found. Meanwhile, on the days when Tom was golfing, I'd take the kids over to Janet's. They loved visiting her, calling her the koi lady. They'd sit by the ponds, drawing pictures of the colorful fish, and then rush home to show them off to Rachel. She'd smile and compliment their drawings, never once realizing that the woman they were spending time with was Tom's wife. It was almost comical how oblivious she was. Rachel seemed more relieved than concerned that I had found a way to keep the kids busy while she was otherwise engaged, as she liked to put it. I tried bringing up the topic of her quitting her job a couple more times, urging her to end things with Tom. But each time, I got the same icy response. The second time was particularly brutal. she made snide comments about my masculinity and suggested that I was the problem. It stung, but it also made it easier for me to justify everything I was doing. I started finding excuses to avoid being intimate with her. The more I distanced myself, the less I felt connected to her. Then, one evening, Rachel dropped a bombshell. She told me she'd been feeling really overwhelmed lately and thought it would be a good idea to take some time off work to visit her sister, Nancy, for a few days, maybe even a whole week. She painted it as if she was doing me a favor, giving me a chance to relax a little after all the overtime and late nights I'd been putting in. I barely slept that night. My mind wouldn't stop racing with everything I needed to plan, everything I needed to do. I knew, right then and there, that this was my opportunity. If I didn't act now, I might never get another chance. The next day, after Rachel left for her so-called rest and recuperation trip, I swung into action. First, I went to my parents and laid it all out. I told them everything, about the affair, the lies, and how I'd failed as a husband. It was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had, but they didn't judge. They were incredibly supportive, offering to do whatever they could to help. My mom immediately agreed to take care of Emma and Josh, and my dad offered to use his truck to help move Rachel's things out of the house. The kids, of course, were thrilled to be spending time with their grandparents, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I wish I could have shielded them from all of this forever, but that wasn't an option anymore. With my dad's truck ready to go and the kids happily settled, I started packing up Rachel's things. As I boxed up her clothes, toiletries, and personal items, a mix of emotions ran through me, sadness, anger, and a strange sense of finality. Each item I put away felt like closing a chapter that had ended long before I'd acknowledged it. It was surreal. I had loved this woman, built a life and a family with her, and now I was packing her out of our home like a tenant who'd overstayed her welcome. As I cleared out her closet, I found myself pausing every now and then, holding up a blouse or a pair of shoes and wondering how it all went so wrong. I kept waiting for some kind of flood of memories or second thoughts, but all I felt was numb. The rest of the day passed in a blur of packing and hauling boxes. My dad didn't ask too many questions, just did what needed to be done. He knew that pushing me right then wouldn't do any good. By the time the sun set, Rachel's things were stacked neatly in the garage, ready for her to pick up when she got back. Then, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out my phone. I typed out a message to Rachel, keeping it as simple and direct as possible, * when you get back, your stuff will be in the garage. Don't come inside. I'll talk to you through the lawyer, *. I stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. When I finally did, it felt like a weight had lifted off my shoulders. This was it. No more pretending, no more looking the other way. This was the start of something new, even if it wasn't the ending I'd ever imagined. After sending the text, I leaned back and closed my eyes, exhausted but relieved. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control. I had taken the first step in reclaiming my life, and that was something. It wasn't going to be easy, far from it, but at least I wasn't stuck in limbo anymore. With Rachel gone and the house finally quiet, I found myself thinking back to Janet. Our strange alliance, born out of betrayal and heartbreak, had somehow turned into a lifeline. I wondered if she was doing the same, sitting in her living room, contemplating what was next for her, too. Maybe I'd drop by tomorrow, bring Emma and Josh over to see the koi again. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A tiny sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd both come out of this a little stronger. On Thursday morning, I made the 3-hour drive to the first clinic where I thought Rachel might go. But when I got there, it turned out to be a dead end. That left me with one last shot, the Family Planning Center. I walked in, trying to look confident, and introduced myself as Matt Foster, saying my wife, Rachel, had sent me over to sign some consent forms. I acted a little clueless, pretending not to know exactly what the form was called, but I mentioned something about needing to acknowledge the procedure and agree not to pursue any legal action afterward. The receptionist nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up Rachel's information. Actually, her sister already signed for her, she said, glancing at the screen, but your signature would be better. She handed me the file, and I signed my name right beneath Nancy's signature, trying to keep my hand from shaking. The procedure was scheduled for Friday morning at 11 a.m., with instructions to arrive an hour earlier. I asked if there were any outstanding payments, but the receptionist reassured me that Rachel had already covered the full $800, paid in cash. I thanked her and left the clinic, feeling both relieved and a little sick to my stomach. I had the details I needed. Now, it was just a matter of timing. The reception I got when I arrived at Nancy and Brad's house was tense, to say the least. Rachel's eyes widened in surprise when she saw me standing there. "What are you doing here?" she asked, forcing a smile. I played it cool and said, "My parents offered to keep the kids for a few days, so I took some sick leave and figured I'd drop by. I needed some time to unwind too, just like you." The room fell into an awkward silence, and I could practically see Rachel and Nancy's minds racing, trying to figure out how to deal with this unexpected twist. Nancy glanced over at Brad and gave him a quick nod. Without a word, he disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the two of them. Rachel tried to keep up the small talk, pretending everything was normal, but I could tell she was on edge. Her eyes kept darting to Nancy, like she was looking for cues on how to handle this. When Brad finally returned, he suggested we take his buddy Jack's boat out on the lake the next day, just to relax and get away from everything. I agreed, saying a day out on the water sounded perfect, even though I had no intention of going anywhere. The next morning, Jack showed up bright and early with the boat, ready to go. As Brad packed up lunch and loaded the cooler with beer, I stood by the passenger door of his truck, watching him. "You getting in?" Brad asked, looking at me with narrowed eyes. I shook my head. "Changed my mind. I'm not wasting my day on a boat with you and Jack. Besides," I added, leaning casually against the truck, "you might want to enjoy yourself, because you're going to have a hell of a time when you get back. I doubt Nancy's going to be in a good mood." Brad blinked, caught off guard. Then he tried to convince me, switching from cursing under his breath to light threats, like a bully who just realized his scare tactics weren't working. But after 5 minutes of going back and forth, he finally got the hint. I wasn't moving. With a string of muttered curses, he gave up, climbed into the truck, and peeled out of the driveway with Jack. Once they were out of sight, I let out a deep breath, my heart still racing, and turned back toward the house. I went inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and did the first thing I could think of. I turned off Rachel's cell phone. Then, I called my dad. He's always up early, and I needed a steady voice on the other end of the line. We ended up chatting for nearly 2 hours while I kept ignoring the call waiting beeps that kept lighting up the screen. I figured Brad was frantically trying to reach Nancy to give her a heads up, but I wasn't about to let that happen. Eventually, Rachel and Nancy wandered downstairs, looking groggy and caught off guard to find me calmly sipping coffee at the dining room table. I ended the call with my dad and set my phone aside, bracing myself for what was sure to be a stormy confrontation. Nancy spotted Rachel's dead phone on the counter, then looked at me, suspicion creeping into her expression. "What are you doing here, Matt?" she asked, her voice sharp. "I'm here because I want some answers," I said evenly. "It's time to stop pretending everything's fine, don't you think?" Rachel shifted uncomfortably, glancing between me and her sister. "Matt, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Rachel." "I know everything," I replied, my gaze never leaving hers. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, maybe. Anger. It didn't matter. I wasn't backing down. "I know about the clinic," I continued, voice steady. "I know about the procedure scheduled for tomorrow morning. I even signed the form myself, right next to Nancy's name. Rachel's face turned white, and for a second, she just stood there, gaping at me like a deer caught in headlights. You can't do that. I never. You didn't think I'd figure it out, did you? I cut her off. You thought you'd sneak around, lie, and get away with it. But I'm done playing the fool. Nancy stepped forward, trying to insert herself between us. Matt, I think we should all just calm down. I'm plenty calm, Nancy, I said, holding up a hand. But I'm not going anywhere until we get some things straight. Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came out. She glanced at Nancy, her expression desperate, like she was silently begging her sister to step in and fix this. But there was no fixing it, not this time. You're not going to that appointment tomorrow, I stated, my voice firm. In fact, you're not doing anything else until we talk about what's really going on. Rachel's mouth moved soundlessly, and then she finally managed to choke out, What do you want, Matt? I want the truth, I said quietly. For once, just tell me the truth. Nancy started to say something, but Rachel cut her off, eyes flashing. Fine. You want to talk? Let's talk. Her voice was tight, her jaw clenched, but at least she wasn't running. Not yet. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit down. Then let's start from the beginning. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. Why don't you tell me exactly what's been going on, Rachel? No lies. No dodging. Just the truth. And so, the unraveling began. It was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment I would finally get the answers I'd been chasing for months. But as Rachel took a deep breath and began to speak, I had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole was about to go. When Nancy's cell phone finally buzzed back to life, she and Rachel had about 5 minutes left before they were supposed to be at the family planning center. I casually poured myself the last cup of coffee from the pot, then brewed a fresh one for them, knowing full well that a storm was brewing. Rachel shot me an annoyed look and asked sharply, What are you still doing here? I leaned back in my chair and shrugged. I decided I'm not in the mood for fishing. Thought I'd stick around and spend the day with you too, I replied evenly. Then I suggested we grab lunch together since I'd have to head out later that night anyway. Rachel immediately shut me down, saying that she and Nancy already had plans and didn't want me tagging along. She emphasized that they only got to see each other a couple of times a year and that I had all week to spend time with her. I could feel my jaw clench. I wasn't backing down. The least you could do is spare me half a day, I pushed back calmly. I drove all the way here. Nancy, clearly frustrated, stomped out of the room to make a phone call. Rachel slumped in her seat, looking like she'd just been hit by a freight train, completely deflated. From where I sat, I could hear Nancy's raised voice in the next room, berating Brad for leaving me behind, as if he'd committed some kind of betrayal. It was almost comical, really. Rachel gave one last attempt to shut me out, saying that their plans didn't involve me and I'd just be an inconvenience. Look, Matt, it's not like you'd enjoy yourself. You'd just be in the way. Why don't you just tell me what these big plans are? I asked, keeping my tone light but firm. Then I can decide whether I want to tag along or find something else to do. Rachel's face flushed slightly, and I couldn't resist pushing a little further. I even threw in a half-joking comment, What, meeting up with some guys? Of course not, she snapped, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She took a deep breath and explained that they were planning on shopping for personal items, bras, underwear, nightgowns, things they didn't exactly want a guy hanging around for. I shrugged nonchalantly. That's fine. Most of those stores are in the mall anyway. I can find something else to do while you two shop. Then I added with a smile, I'll even treat you to lunch afterward, to make up for any inconvenience. Just then, Nancy stormed back into the room, glaring at me with such intensity that I almost expected her to start spitting fire. Rachel must have realized that there was no winning this one. With a defeated sigh, she muttered that she needed to go get dressed. 20 minutes later, they both came downstairs, faces tight with irritation but resigned to the fact that I was tagging along. I had a strong hunch that Nancy's phone call had been to the family planning center, likely to reschedule the appointment. I'd made it clear I'd be leaving that night, so they probably figured they could wait me out and go after I was gone. But I wasn't giving them an inch. "I'll drive," I insisted, holding out my car keys. I made it clear I wasn't about to let them ditch me somewhere while they slipped off to handle their business. With tight-lipped expressions, they climbed into my car. We made a stop at a gas station, and I took my sweet time. I topped off the tank, checked the oil and water, cleaned the windshield, all at a leisurely pace. It was probably the longest I'd ever spent on routine car maintenance, and the two of them just sat there, fuming in silence. When we finally got to the mall, I parked far off, so we'd have a long walk to the entrance. Once inside, I stayed close enough to remind them I was there, but far enough to give them a sense of false privacy. Rachel and Nancy went through the motions, stopping in a few lingerie stores, but they didn't seem to be enjoying themselves at all. Every glance they exchanged was laced with irritation, every whisper punctuated by furtive glances in my direction. I played it cool, watching from a distance but making sure I was always within sight. They bounced between racks of clothing without actually buying much of anything, as if they couldn't focus on shopping with me lurking around. Rachel's shoulders were hunched, her smile tight and forced whenever a store clerk tried to offer help. Eventually, Rachel turned to me, trying to sound casual. "Hey, why don't you go check out that sports store we passed earlier? You don't have to follow us around all day." I shook my head. "Nah, I'm good here. I'll catch up on some emails while you two browse." Rachel sighed heavily, clearly exasperated. "You don't have to be up in our business every second, Matt." I glanced up from my phone and raised an eyebrow. "You're right, I don't," I said slowly. "But I'm here anyway." The rest of the shopping trip continued in strained silence. They ducked into a few more stores, looking at random items without buying anything. I could almost see the frustration building in Rachel's eyes. She'd never been good at hiding her emotions. And as for Nancy, she looked ready to strangle me on the spot. After what felt like forever, Rachel turned to Nancy and muttered something under her breath. Nancy threw her hands up in a dramatic gesture and spun around, heading for the exit without a word. Rachel hesitated, then shot me a look that was part resentment, part resignation. "Lunch?" she asked tightly. "Absolutely," I said with a smile that probably infuriated her even more. We ended up at a small Italian bistro just outside the mall, a place I knew Rachel liked. I ordered a simple sandwich, watching as Rachel picked at a salad, clearly too annoyed to eat. Nancy sat across from us, her face a mask of barely restrained fury. I was almost tempted to offer her a glass of wine, just to see if she'd throw it at me. "So," I began casually, "what's the plan for tomorrow?" Rachel's eyes flashed with something like panic. "I don't know, Matt. Why do you care so much? Can't you just—" "No," I interrupted, leaning forward. "I can't just go home and pretend I don't see what's going on." Nancy slammed her fork down on the table, and the sound seemed to echo in the small restaurant. "We don't owe you a damn explanation." I smiled slightly, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction. "Maybe not. But you're going to give me one anyway." Rachel looked away, her jaw tight. And in that moment, I knew I'd won, at least for now. They were cornered, scrambling to find a way out of a mess they'd created. And no matter what they tried, I wasn't letting go until I had the truth, all of it. Lunch ended in silence, and I drove us back to the house. Tomorrow was the day. Whatever they had planned, whatever secrets they were hiding, I'd be right there. Waiting. Ready to blow their whole charade wide open. They bought a few things here and there, but it was clear they were just going through the motions, pretending to be focused on shopping. I kept an eye on them, but I couldn't have cared less what they were tossing into their bags. The real win was the fact that I'd managed to disrupt their plans. By now, the appointment time had come and gone, and I knew Rachel would have to reschedule. It wasn't that I wanted to stop her altogether, I just wanted to throw a wrench in her smooth little operation, a small way to regain some semblance of control. Around noon, we regrouped in the center court of the mall, just as we'd loosely agreed upon earlier. We ended up having lunch at the Olive Garden. The food was bland, and the atmosphere was as tense as a coiled spring. Afterward, we headed back to the house around 2 p.m. The car ride was thick with tension, every second stretching out painfully. They didn't say much, but I could feel the heat of their anger directed at me from the back seat. I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't the one being yanked around like a puppet. When we finally got back, I grabbed a beer and settled on the couch, feeling more satisfied than I had in a long time. A couple of hours later, Brad stumbled in, only to be met with a storm of fury from Nancy. She tore into him for a solid 30 minutes, her voice rising and falling in a relentless wave of accusations. By the time she was done, he looked like a beaten dog and mumbled something before slipping out of the house, disappearing until dinner. That evening, once we'd finished cleaning up the dishes, I asked Rachel if we could have a private word in the kitchen. Nancy glared at me like I'd just spit on her shoes, but she didn't say anything, just retreated into the living room with her arms crossed tight over her chest. Rachel looked exhausted, clearly drained from the day's events, but I knew I needed to push through. This conversation had been a long time coming. I didn't waste any time. I want you to quit your job and cut off whatever's going on with Matt Bradley, I said quietly but firmly. Rachel's eyes narrowed, and she clenched her jaw so hard I thought she might crack a tooth. I'm not going to listen to this again, she shot back, her voice tight. I'm done with you bringing it up. I've told you 100 times, I'm not quitting, and I'm not ending my friendship with him. You're putting me in a corner, Rachel, I said softly. You know how I feel, and I'm not asking for much. She practically trembled with rage. Enough, Matt. Change the subject, or you can leave. I stayed silent, meeting her furious gaze with calm resolve. Then, slowly, I reached into the manila envelope I'd brought with me and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. I placed it on the table between us and slid it toward her. Inside were divorce papers. Her eyes widened for a split second, then narrowed dangerously. I kept my voice steady, almost gentle. I've asked you at least 10 times over the past couple of months to quit your job and end whatever this is with Matt. Each time, you've refused. I'm done waiting for you to make a decision. So, I made it for you. Rachel glared down at the envelope as if it were a snake poised to strike. What is this, Matt? Divorce papers, I answered plainly. You can have your lawyer look them over if you want. I included a self-addressed, stamped envelope. Just sign and mail them in when you're ready. The muscles in her face tightened, and she leaned forward across the table, her expression twisted with fury. You can't just divorce me because I won't quit my job or stop talking to someone you don't like, she hissed, voice low but seething with anger. There are laws, Matt. You need grounds for a divorce, and you don't have any. You've got nothing. I didn't react, just watched her calmly. Are you sure about that? Rachel blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? I leaned back in my chair and folded my arms, keeping my gaze steady. I'm saying that you might want to think twice before you make assumptions about what I do or don't have. And what I'm willing to do to get the truth. Her face paled slightly, but she quickly recovered, narrowing her eyes in defiance. Go home, Matt. Get your act together. I'm your wife, and I'm not going anywhere. This is my home too, and I'm not giving it up just because you're having some kind of midlife crisis. Midlife crisis? I repeated, shaking my head slowly. Is that what you think this is? She didn't respond, just stared at me, her breathing heavy. The silence stretched, thick and heavy between us. Finally, I stood up and picked up the envelope, tapping it lightly on the table. "Rachel," I said softly, "I love you. I really do. But I can't live like this anymore. And you're right, I can't make you quit your job. I can't make you end your friendship with Matt. But I also don't have to stick around and watch you tear our marriage apart, one lie at a time." Her lip curled in a sneer. "You're so dramatic." "Maybe," I admitted. "But at least I'm being honest about it." For a second, I thought she was going to explode. Then she seemed to deflate, slumping back in her chair, her expression hardening into something cold and unreadable. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll have a lawyer look them over." "Take your time," I said quietly. "But don't think for a second that I'm bluffing." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sitting there, staring at the papers like they were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. When I stepped into the living room, Nancy looked up sharply, her eyes darting between me and the envelope in my hand. "What the hell is that?" she demanded. I just smiled faintly. The beginning of the end. Then I headed out of the house, climbed into my car, and drove off, my heart pounding but my mind strangely clear. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. I'd stood my ground, refused to be bulldozed or guilt-tripped. Now, it was up to Rachel to make her choice. As I drove away, the envelope still resting on the passenger seat beside me, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm settle over me. For the first time in a long while, I was taking charge of my own life. And no matter what Rachel did next, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to be the passive, blindsided husband anymore. Instead of responding to Rachel's rant, I reached back into my envelope and pulled out a small stack of photographs. With deliberate calm, I laid out 6 glossy pictures on the table, each one capturing her and Matt in various compromising positions. I leaned back slightly, watching her reaction as I asked, "Are these grounds for divorce, Rachel?" For a split second, Rachel's face went completely white, and I thought she might faint. But just as quickly, her shock shifted to rage. Instead of showing even a shred of remorse, she exploded at me, yelling for me to stop putting the photos on the table. "You sneaky, underhanded bastard," she screamed. "How dare you spy on me?" She hurled every insult she could think of, her voice rising to a shrill pitch, calling me a pervert, a creep, and worse. She demanded to know why I hadn't confronted her face to face and accused me of being some sick voyeur who actually enjoyed this twisted game of cat and mouse. I just sat there, stone-faced, as she ranted. And then my phone buzzed. It was my dad, letting me know he'd be pulling up in about 10 minutes with Rachel's belongings. I hung up and turned back to her. She was still fuming, her face flushed an angry red. "Who was that?" she spat. I met her gaze calmly. "That was my dad. He's bringing your stuff over to Nancy's. I've already changed the locks at the house. If you left anything behind, let me know, and I'll get it for you." For the first time, she was completely speechless, just staring at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. I reached back into my envelope and pulled out the next item, the signed title to her car. I slid it across the table. "This is yours now," I said quietly. "I signed it over to you this morning." I placed another envelope beside it, containing half of the money from our joint bank accounts, around $200. "And here's your share of what we had saved." Rachel's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no words coming out. I continued, outlining the visitation rights she'd have with the kids. "You'll see them once a week," I stated flatly, "and possibly have an overnight stay once a month. But that's only if you make a formal statement attesting to the affair and have it notarized." Her expression morphed from shock to indignation. "You can't." "Yes, I can," I interrupted sharply. "And one more thing," I paused, watching her closely. "I have a DVD of your little get-together with Matt at the Scandia Motel from May 10th. It's 2 hours long and shows everything these pictures didn't. Rachel's face contorted with anger, but I didn't flinch. I calmly collected the photos from the table, stacking them neatly. I didn't take these myself, by the way. I'm not that invested in what you do behind my back. But I can't stand being lied to. I reached into the envelope one last time and pulled out a small item, the safety pin I'd been carrying around for weeks. I slid it across the table toward her. Rachel looked at it, then back at me, completely confused. I used this, I said softly, to poke holes in all the condoms you've been using for the past 2 months. Her eyes went wide as saucers, and her face turned a deep, beet red color as my words sank in. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. 48 rubbers in 2 weeks, I continued, leaning back and crossing my arms. More than I ever imagined you'd go through. I guess you really have been busy. Rachel looked like she was about to explode. She shot up out of her chair, pointing a trembling finger at me. You miserable, disgusting weasel, she screamed. That's the most despicable thing I've ever heard of. I didn't bat an eye. The most despicable thing is cheating on me and lying about it for months, I replied coldly. You may think I'm a fool, Rachel, but the truth is, you're the one who threw away our marriage. Rachel seemed to deflate, the fire draining out of her as the reality of our situation set in. I stood up slowly, slipping the envelope with the papers back into my bag. I need to get going, I said quietly, glancing out the window. My dad just pulled into the driveway. I turned to leave, but then paused at the doorway. You know what, Rachel? You haven't once apologized. Not a single time. No remorse, no guilt. Just anger that you got caught. Rachel stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. But I didn't wait for a response. I turned and made my way out of the kitchen. Goodbye, Rachel, I called over my shoulder. And good luck with your appointment on Monday. That's when the tears finally came. Rachel's shoulders shook as she started sobbing, her face crumpling. Nancy rushed in from the living room, wrapping her arms around her sister and whispering soothing words, but I kept walking, refusing to look back. When I stepped out onto the porch, Brad was standing there, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. He took one look at me, then back at the house, clearly trying to piece together what had just happened. You can't just throw away 14 years of marriage over a misunderstanding, he blurted out, desperation lacing his words. A misunderstanding? I repeated incredulously. Is that what you call it? Brad opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He fumbled for a moment, then finally muttered, She's your wife, man. You can't just. I didn't throw it away, Brad, I said quietly, cutting him off. Rachel did. I'm just cleaning up the mess. He shook his head slowly, still looking like he was trying to grasp the enormity of it all. But, Matt. I'm done, Brad, I said firmly. I tried, and I'm done. Then I looked him square in the eye. I'd worry about your own marriage if I were you. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving Brad standing on the porch, staring after me with his mouth half open. When I reached my dad's truck, he gave me a somber look, his eyes searching mine. You okay, son? Yeah, Dad, I murmured, glancing back at the house one last time. I'm okay. Let's get out of here. We drove away in silence, the weight of everything hanging heavy in the air. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. It was over, and I was finally ready to move forward, on my own terms. I shot back at Brad, asking why Rachel had even bothered coming down to visit him and Nancy if it was all just some misunderstanding. He looked down at his feet, clearly grappling with how to respond. After a few long moments, he muttered a half-hearted apology and then offered to help unload the truck. We made quick work of it, finishing in about 10 minutes while Rachel stayed holed up in the kitchen, still crying. To me, her tears didn't mean a damn thing. Too little, too late. The fallout hit harder than I'd expected. By the end of the next week, both Rachel and Matt were fired from Liberty Insurance. Rachel refused to sign the affidavit Janet's lawyer had requested, but my attorney assured me we had a solid enough case without it. I didn't hear a single word from Rachel after that night, no calls, no texts, nothing. She didn't even show up to see the kids, but honestly, they didn't seem to miss her. They were forming a bond with Janet, and we started spending a lot of time together as a kind of makeshift family. There wasn't any talk of romance between Janet and me, not yet, at least. We were both just focused on getting through the nightmare of our divorces and taking care of the kids. Over the next few months, I ended up learning more about koi fish than I'd ever imagined, and to my surprise, I enjoyed every minute of it. Being around Janet was peaceful. It was a stark contrast to the chaos I'd been living in for so long. Finally, after 4 long, grueling months, both divorces were finalized. Rachel didn't fight it, just signed the papers and disappeared. But Matt? He went down kicking and screaming, dragging out every detail in court. He lost everything, the house, their investments, and even ended up saddled with a hefty monthly alimony payment to Janet. I didn't feel a shred of sympathy for him. He'd gotten exactly what he deserved. Then, a few days before Christmas, Rachel showed up at the house. I opened the door, taken aback to see her standing there with a handful of brightly wrapped presents for Emma and Josh. I decided to keep things civil for the kids' sake and didn't do or say anything to spoil the holiday. She stayed for about 2 hours, acting like the perfect mother, smiling, laughing, asking them about school and their friends. It was surreal, like watching a stranger play a part in a bad movie. We didn't talk about the divorce, the affair, or anything that had gone down. It was like none of it had ever happened. When she finally left, slipping out as quietly as she'd arrived, I was surprised to find that I felt lighter. Maybe it was closure, or maybe it was just relief that I didn't have to deal with her anymore. Either way, I felt like I could finally move on. The house went up for sale in February, and 2 months later, I moved in with Janet. Tom had taken some low-level sales job out in Omaha, and Rachel had gone with him, still clinging to whatever shred of that relationship was left. But 4 months later, Tom vanished without a trace. He didn't even tell Rachel where he was going, just up and disappeared. She was left stranded, so she moved back in with Nancy, who was going through her own marital disaster after Brad took a job on the Alaskan pipeline. He mailed Nancy the divorce papers, just like that, leaving her high and dry. It was almost poetic, in a dark, twisted way, the two sisters abandoned by the men they thought they could build their lives around. Meanwhile, things between Janet and me kept moving forward, steady and sure. We were comfortable together, and she absolutely adored the kids. They loved her back just as fiercely, almost like they'd found the mother figure they'd been missing all along. We spent as much time together as we could, our lives slowly knitting together into a cohesive whole. By June, we were making plans for our wedding. We'd both put the trauma and heartbreak of our previous marriages behind us and were looking forward to a fresh start, a new chapter built on something real. Life had finally settled into a peaceful, happy routine. The chaos of the past year felt like a distant memory, one I didn't care to revisit. And as for Matt, the man Rachel had betrayed me for, he didn't fare so well. A few weeks after he disappeared, word got around that he'd been mugged outside his favorite bar. Apparently, he'd gotten into a scuffle with a couple of guys over something stupid and ended up in the hospital with a broken jaw and a few cracked ribs. It was hard to find out exactly what happened, but one thing was clear, Matt's life had gone off the rails. Rachel, desperate and alone, tried to track him down, but from what I heard through mutual contacts, he wanted nothing to do with her. The guy had burned too many bridges, and now he was paying the price. He lost his job, his reputation, and any hope of rebuilding what little was left of his life. As for Rachel, she moved back to Nancy's place, clinging to whatever scraps of stability she could find. The woman who'd once been so confident, so sure of herself, was now just a shell of who she used to be. It wasn't that I wanted to see her suffer, but a part of me couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. She'd made her choices. She'd thrown away our marriage and broken our family, all for a man who left her high and dry the first chance he got. Now, it was just me, Janet, and the kids. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt like I had a real shot at happiness. We were planning our future, looking forward instead of backward. Every day brought a little more hope, a little more joy. And for that, I was grateful. By the time the holidays rolled around again, Janet and I were married. We celebrated Christmas together in our new home, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and love. I never would have guessed that a year earlier, when I was sitting in that miserable hotel room trying to catch Rachel in the act, that I'd be standing here now, holding the hand of a woman who truly loved me and treated my kids like her own. Rachel was just a shadow of the past, a lesson learned the hard way. And while it hadn't been easy, I'd come out stronger on the other side. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Sometimes, even in the darkest moments, it's clearing a path for something better. For us, the worst was over. The future was bright, and for once, I was actually looking forward to seeing where it would take us. The attack on Matt had been brutal. They'd left him in a crumpled heap with 5 shattered ribs, busted kneecaps, and a mouthful of broken teeth. He even lost his wallet, and one of his testicles, during the beating. It seemed karma had finally caught up with him, and the consequences of his reckless, cheating lifestyle were now all too real. His days of carefree wandering were over. As for me and Janet, we kept building something solid, something real. Our bond grew deeper, not just as partners but as a family. The kids were thriving, and we all found a kind of unexpected peace in our new lives. We spent countless afternoons by the koi ponds, feeding the fish and enjoying the calm rhythm of the days. After all the upheaval and heartache, it felt like we'd finally found the life we were meant to have, a life filled with laughter, love, and none of the constant turmoil that had defined our pasts. One afternoon, Janet surprised me with something incredible. She took me to see a 6-bedroom villa she'd bought nearby, using the money she'd saved from before selling her business. The place was stunning, a beautiful home with a sprawling yard and a large, crystal blue pool just waiting to be filled with the sounds of summer splashing. It was the kind of house that felt like a promise of a future brimming with joy, stability, and endless possibilities. But Janet had another surprise up her sleeve. As we explored the villa, she led me to the garage, her eyes twinkling with excitement. Inside, sitting there like a memory brought to life, was my old Jaguar XK140. The car that had been such a big part of my past, a symbol of freedom and speed, was back in my life. She'd kept it hidden away, polished and pristine, waiting for the right moment to reveal it to me. I ran my hand along the hood, a smile spreading across my face. "You've had this all along?" I asked, stunned. She nodded, grinning. "It's been waiting for us, waiting for you." I could hardly believe it. The Jaguar had been more than just a car to me. It represented a piece of who I was before everything went to hell, a part one thought I'd lost forever. But here it was, gleaming under the garage lights, just like new. That day wasn't far off when we'd take it out for a drive again. We already had a plan in mind, a long coastal trip to a familiar French restaurant where we'd sit back, relax, and celebrate how far we'd come, me, Janet, and the Jaguar, all together. And what about Rachel? The last I heard, she was still bunking with Nancy, picking up the pieces of her life after Matt's betrayal. She'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. I no longer carried any bitterness or anger when I thought of her, just a kind of distant pity. But that was her problem to deal with now, not mine. I'd moved on, left that chapter closed for good. Life with Janet felt like a dream I didn't know I could have. It was filled with little moments of pure contentment, the kids running around the yard, the fish gliding lazily through the pond, the quiet conversations we'd have over morning coffee as sunlight streamed through the windows of our new home. It wasn't just a fresh start, it was the life we'd both fought hard to build. And now that we were here, we weren't taking a single second of it for granted. We talked about the future often, how we'd spend the coming years growing our family, traveling together, and making new memories. It was a future I'd never imagined back when I was drowning in suspicion and heartbreak, trying to catch Rachel in one lie after another. But now, all of that seemed so far away, like a bad dream that had faded with the morning light. Janet and I were planning our wedding, and every detail felt like another step toward the life we deserved, a life of love, trust, and genuine happiness. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a future that honored the strength we'd gained from surviving it. And so, we drove forward. Me, Janet, and the kids, plus the Jaguar. Together, we were writing a new story, one filled with hope and promise. As for Rachel, Matt, and the wreckage they'd made of their lives, well, that was a tale I no longer needed to be a part of. We were free. Free to love, free to laugh, and free to chase the future we both wanted. It's funny how life works out sometimes, how, even in the darkest chapters, there's a light waiting to guide you forward if you're willing to look for it. As I look back now, sitting in our new home with the kids laughing in the next room and Janet by my side, I know one thing for certain, the worst is behind us, and the best is still ahead. And for the first time in a long, long while, I'm not just okay with that, I'm excited. So here's to the future. Here's to new beginnings and second chances. Here's to the life we've fought so hard to create. Because we've finally made it. And we're not looking back.